Alrighty, welcome back everyone. So we're going to start the actual material for General Biology 181. And since we are studying biology, we need to talk about what biology is. So we are going to cover the introduction to biology. So the objectives for this first chapter that you should be able to discuss with one another and be able to have a good grasp of are listed right here. And it's basically going to be your ability to explain the unifying principles of life, to understand the levels of biological organization, understanding the evolution that's going to lead to biological unity and diversity. Then we're going to talk about how, and you should be able to understand how the biological organisms are classified, which is known as taxonomy. And then finally, understanding the processes of biological investigation. And with that, you should be able to use the LearnSmart reading software through McGraw-Hill to be able to understand and review that. All right. So when we talk about life, obviously life has a very complex definition. What we're going to do is discuss the basic characteristics or principles that are required for an organism to be classified as alive. So we have multiple principles listed right here. These are characteristics, and we're going to be going over these individually in the upcoming PowerPoint. So the first statement is the principle or the characteristic is that cells are the simplest unit of life. Second, the fact that living organisms must be able to use energy, they must be able to produce energy. Third, living organisms interact with their environment. That means that they are sensitive. They have sensitivity. There is what's known as responsiveness, the ability to respond to the environment, whether it's an organism responding to the outside environment like heat or cold, or responding to the internal environment for you, for example, different hormones, different, for example, the sugars, proteins, so on and so forth. Fourth, the ability of living organisms to maintain homeostasis. And we're going to talk about homeostasis, but in essence, you can think of homeostasis as balance. Basically being able to maintain the correct amount of molecules, hormones, sugars, proteins, whatever it may be for the organism to survive. Fifth principle, living organisms must be able to grow and develop. Six, genetic material provides a blueprint for the process of reproduction. So living organisms must be able to reproduce. Seven, populations of organisms evolve from one generation to the next. Principle 8, all species are related by an evolutionary history. So we're going to talk about that throughout the semester. 9, the big one in biology, the big concept that I'm going to be talking about over and over and over, and you'll be hearing about this in upper level classes, for example, anatomy and physiology. Structure is related to function. The structure of something will affect its function. Therefore, if you have the structure damaged, you're going to also affect the function or damage the function. Principle 10, new properties of life will emerge from the complex interactions, or what's known as they're adaptable. So, for example, properties that were not seen in the prior level of hierarchy, for example, when we go from atoms to molecules, we didn't have bonds present. That is the new property that emerges when the next level, for example, going from atoms to molecules, molecules to macromolecules, macromolecules to organelles, organelles to cells, and then cells to tissue. Each level that we move up to has a new emergent property that was not present in the previous level. 11 and 12 basically are principles that were seen after much observation, obviously, because you're going to see that biology, as all the sciences, is based on observation. So the fact that biology is an experimental science, and then that biology actually affects our society. So let's go through these characteristics or principles one by one. All right, the first principle. Cells are the simplest unit of life. So basically, the cell is actually, quote unquote, alive. It is a living, sustaining structure. It is able to undergo all those characteristics or principles that were discussed. So basically, when you look at the cell, you're going to see that there's an internal space that is organized and ordered, that is separated from the external environment. And basically, when we talk about the cell itself, you can see that we have, and what biologists have developed as a theory known as the cell theory. And that is that all organisms are composed of cells, one or more cells. Cells are the smallest unit of life, so that's why we have the simplest unit of life right here. And excuse me, pre-existing cells will give rise to new cells via cell division. So for example, you have a cell, and then with the replication of the DNA, which we're going to go over when we talk about the cell cycle, we'll create a new cell, and then you have two identical daughter cells right here. We're going to see that the cells will then come together to form the tissue. So you can see here the skin, so in the integumentary system right here, we have the skeletal system, which has the bones and the joints and the cartilage, and then the skeletal, musculoskeletal system that we're going to be talking about in other classes. All right, 2, living organisms use energy. All the cellular processes that a cell undergoes, that means whether it's division, whether it's producing sugar, whether it's breaking down sugar, whether it's making proteins or breaking down proteins, all require energy. So when we talk about the use of energy in an organism, we are talking about metabolism. And metabolism is defined as the sum of all the chemical reactions in an organism. That is the sum of all the anabolic reactions. So that is where you are building molecules, and the sum of the catabolic reactions where you are breaking down molecules. So, for example, when we talk about anabolism right here, the example is photosynthesis. We're using energy, which is in the form of the sun. So it's sunlight energy sending down. Basically, the light energy has photons inside it, which will then go through a complex process that we're going to be discussing later on to produce sugar. The sugar then can be stored, and we can utilize that later on. And the organisms that undergo photosynthesis can utilize it themselves, or we as organisms that do not undergo photosynthesis will utilize that stored energy. In terms of catabolism, the big example that we're going to be talking about in chapter 6 and chapter 7, cellular respiration, the ability to take sugar and break it down to produce the cellular energy currency known as ATP, okay, adenosine triphosphate, which we are going to cover in great detail. So you can see right here, example for a tree right here, sunlight energy, the leaf, the cells in the leaves of the tree have chloroplasts. They will then take the sunlight energy and produce glucose and oxygen. We will take that or consume the glucose and utilize the oxygen to undergo the cellular respiration process, where we produce the carbon dioxide as waste and the water. So you can see it's an ongoing cycle that we're going to be talking about. 3, living organisms will interact with their environment. Again, sensitivity. Sensitivity, the ability to respond, to the environment, whether it be, for example, right here, the breastfeeding of the baby, basically, which, again, it is a series of chemical reactions that are picked up in the brain. Usually the mother will hear the baby crying, and then there'll be a release of oxytocin from the pituitary gland, which will then allow what we call milk letdown. And then that's going to basically push the secretion of milk in a response what we known as positive feedback. Okay, so the ability to respond to environment. Also, you can think about, for example, if you're going up a chairlift on the mountain, and as you go from the bottom of the mountain to the top of the mountain, it gets colder. Your body's going to respond to that, basically increase or decrease the temperature by increasing metabolic reactions, for example, the shivering in the body to help keep you warm. All right, so you can see right here exactly what I was talking about, shivering to keep your body warm when you get cold, and then the sweating process to cool your body when you are hot. So we'll talk about that later on. All right, the ability to maintain homeostasis, crucial, okay? Homeostasis is the ability to maintain stable internal condition. That means everything has to be maintained in such a way that the function is not affected. So I mean, for example, being able to maintain your heart rate, your respiration rate, your digestive rate, the ability to produce waste such as urine, all of that is based on homeostasis, which is really, really, really important. You can see the example right here, teeter-totter. Homeostasis is balance, okay? So you can have an imbalance, for example, arise, and then you'll have the imbalance corrected, which is what is constantly going on inside of you and constantly going on inside of organisms. It doesn't matter if it's you, which is 100 trillion cell organism, or, for example, paramecium amoeba that is a single-celled organism. Example, maintaining your core body temperature is just a series of very complex reactions that work together to ensure that you maintain the core body temperature of 98.6 degrees. Obviously, we do have either organisms such as bacteria that can cause an increase in the temperature, or, for example, in external environments. For example, we can be out exposure, too much being outside in cold weather for too long. Again, your body can only do so much for a certain period of time, and then it's not going to be able to maintain it. So then you can get hypothermia, which can then turn into a medical emergency, a fever, which can then also turn into a medical emergency. So again, you just want to maintain the normal body temperature. So homeostasis. The fifth principle or characteristic, organisms will grow and develop. So again, growth is where you have more or larger cells, so you're going to increase size and weight, again, or development and differentiation. So the fact that we went from a single sperm to an egg that was fertilized, became a zygote. That zygote then differentiated, formed an embryo, which then formed a fetus, and then had formed this baby. This baby was born, and then through nourishment, the baby continues to change and grow. And this is what you have right here, this beautiful little girl right here. All right, so what is differentiation? I talked about differentiation. It is the fact that a single cell can form different types of cells. That is what's known as differentiation. So we have the stem cells, and that's why you hear about stem cells in the news, and it's so much fanfare, and it's the cure-all for everything out there, because you can program a stem cell to become a specific type of cell that you want. So, and that's what's already going on inside of you. You have a single type of cell that gives rise to your muscle, your fat, your bone, your blood cells, your nerve cells, your skin cells, your epithelial, immune cells, and your sex cells, so on and so forth. So you know that that's occurring because we all arose from a single cell, right? And then be differentiated to become you. Again, very fascinating topic right here. Stem cell research, stem cell development. Again, I know many colleagues in the Phoenix area that are utilizing stem cells to help. For example, I know one person, a colleague of mine who's a physician, that has used stem cells to regenerate the cartilage between a knee. For example, between the femur and the tibia and the fibula, which results in the bone-on-bone interaction after, for example, from osteoarthritis. Well, inject the stem cells in there, the stem cells differentiated to cartilage, and he was actually able to regenerate the cartilage for that patient, which was absolutely fascinating. You can see that the differentiation will occur. So, for example, this is in our integument. So you can see for the tissue going from the basement membrane and then all the way up to different types of cells. So again, movement and differentiation of the cells. All right, the sixth principle or characteristic, the fact that the genetic material, okay, which is DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is going to provide the blueprint for reproduction. And DNA basically contains the heritable information, the ability to transfer your genes to your offspring. And then also the DNA, which is very important, has the instructions for building the organism, the ability to take a DNA molecule, which has the code inside it, to make the proteins. And the proteins are basically you. You are an expression of your proteins. So this process, which we'll talk about in great detail, is known as gene expression, the ability to take DNA, make RNA out of the DNA, and then in turn the RNA producing proteins. The process of DNA to RNA, known as transcription, and the process of RNA to protein, known as translation, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Number 7. We know basically through the advent and again with the advancement of science through genetic research and the Genome Project, we are able to see that organisms are going to evolve from one generation to the next. So we know that evolution did occur, and we can see and actually find evidence of evolution in organisms today. For example, in a whale, you can see the vestigial remnants of the pelvis in the femur, which shows that they used to be land mammals before they made their way into the sea. So again, you can, organisms have the ability to evolve. We have evolved, obviously, from our ancestors. We are now Homo sapiens sapiens, but we came from Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, so on and so forth. Okay, all species, again, touching on evolution, again, we're all related by an evolutionary history, which we'll talk about in great detail and covered again in 182. And basically, the fact that the first cells that arose on our planet 4.2 billion years ago, the first organisms, gave rise to us. So again, we'll talk about how that came about. So you can see the fact that we have the life cycle of the planet right here. And again, basically that we share a lot of the DNA of our former ancestors. We still are carrying the DNA. All right, number 9. In biology, this is big in physiology, which we'll be talking about, and that is the fact that structure determines the function. Okay, so the structure of, for example, a cell fails, that means you're going to have the affected. So big important concept in biology, the fact that function is related to structure. That means if you have the structure fail, then the function will fail. You will not be able to properly, for example, let's say the structure, the cell membrane in a cell is damaged. All right, that means you're not going to be able to maintain the integrity of the cell, and the cell is not going to function properly. Okay, so the egg, you can see the structure. Well, an egg, we know, gives life. Okay, so there's a chick, or we can have an egg and we can scramble it and have it for breakfast. Okay, but you cannot unscramble an egg, and then you cannot take the egg and that's been fried or scrambled, I'm sorry, not scrambled, fried, turned into, back into a chick, for example. All right. So again, the ability to be healthy is a series of basically reactions in the body and the ability for the structures to maintain their integrity to allow function to occur properly. All right, 10 new properties of life emerge from complex interactions. Basically the ability to adaptation, okay? For example, we have a lot of bacteria out there that a lot of you may have heard the names of in news or been diagnosed with when you've gone to your family doctor or physician. And this is a great example of the ability to see evolution right before your eyes. And that is the ability for bacteria to evolve. Now, it's fascinating in terms of science, but it is actually catastrophic in medicine. So the ability, for example, of Staphylococcus aureus, Staph aureus, to be able to evolve where the, for example, antibiotic known as methicillin, not to be effective on it. So the penicillins basically work by attacking the cell wall of the bacteria. And what happened with Staph aureus is it mutated and evolved to the point where it changed its cell wall, the way its cell wall is composed, and is able to fight off the use of methicillin. So if you do target the Staph aureus with methicillin, it's not going to do anything. okay? Again, you can see that it is just continuing to reproduce because it is adapted. Now, what caused that? Well, a lot of theories, but the big one is the misuse of antibiotics, and that's what we talk about in medicine a lot, and that's what we are seeing as physicians, worrying about the Staphylococcus aureus becoming resistant to super antibiotics, for example. We'll talk more about that later on in the semester. All right. Finally, the other principles that arose are basically through observation, and that is biology is an experimental science, and biology affects our society. You can see here from Spider-Man universe, okay, with great power comes great responsibility, but what we're saying here, with great knowledge of biology comes great responsibility. So it's really fascinating. I'm glad that you've chosen to start your journey of biology with me. It is, again, this is why I chose it, because it is absolutely an amazing field. All right, so when we talk about organization of life, we want to talk about organization. So I've talked about this briefly earlier in our discussion, and I talked about this fact that we have a hierarchy of life. And basically, we know that everything is comprised of atoms. In life, the atoms will come together to form molecules, and then the molecules will come together to form the macromolecules. The macromolecules will come together to form the organelles. The organelles come together to form cells. Cells of the same type will come together to form tissues. Tissues will form organs, and then organ systems come together and they form an organism. So this is basically the biological part in terms of when we talk about the hierarchy of living organisms. Now we can actually take and look at the hierarchy of the planet as a living, basically, biosphere that is giving life. And it's basically the fact that you have organisms that are similar living together to form a population. Population will then have the community. The community is contained in the ecosystem, and then you can see finally that the ecosystem is contained in the biosphere, and that's where all the living organisms exist. So it is pretty fascinating. We're going to be focusing in Bio 181 up to here onto the organism, but then actually through a cell. We'll talk a little bit about this. But then in 182, we're going to pick up here and talk about the relation of organisms with the ecosystem and the biosphere. All right. So as I stated earlier, we know that all things, all living things will evolve. We arose from a common ancestor, and the fact that we are able to evolve, again, it's because adapting to the environment that we're in is going to allow the organism, or to allow us, for example, to prosper, okay? So we're going to talk about the different ways that we have evolution, the way that evolution does occur, and I'm going to do that in the next video, okay? So if there are any questions about this, please be sure to talk to your classmates. Go to the tutoring center, and then again, feel free to ask me questions during our my office hours via Zoom, or to send an email. All right, so I'm going to now stop this video and then pick up in the next video.